Our next speaker is Mr. Aahit Gaba from Hewlett-Packard. He is a senior open source counsel with diverse experience in handling open source licensing issues, drafting open source policies, and conducting merger acquisition open source due diligence. He was credited as a main contributor in the book Open Source for Business, which is a practical guide to open source licensing and spoken at various international and national conferences like Black Duck Software Legal Conference, Force Asia, and Open Source India Conference. The following slides are the patent portfolio I retrieved yesterday from Patent Crawl, which was developed by Taiwanese company Inquatic. As you can see, the legendary Hewlett-Packard patent application chain, the issue chain, patent pledge and licensing, and patent value and patent quality, legal status, and patent global distribution. Nevertheless, the patent enforcement charts. Mr. Gaba, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and Stephen, thank you for giving us the background for the IP discussions. So, Nitin has about open source and as a challenge in IP, one of the IP challenges, I think he left that for me. All right, so, yeah, thank you, I appreciate that. So, all right, I would like to, take out a little spotlight to open source software, which is another subset of IP portfolio in a broader domain. And the key takeaway from this talk will be the awareness about open source software in general, and what are the key pillars for the right open source strategy. So yeah, a few facts like this February, coming February 3rd, open source community will be celebrating 25th anniversary of the introduction of the term open source software. Like in 25 years ago, 1998, the word open source was coined. So another 25 years to open source. And in today's world, 99% of the software products contains open source, and it is indispensable to have a comprehensive open source policy for optimum utilization of open source code. And I would now just a small disclaimer: this is not a legal advice, and anything you learn from this, please do not consider as a legal advice. This is a very small lineup. I'll try to. Sorry, I haven't seen this slide. My bad. Okay. That was the disclaimer. Here. Very small lineup. I'll try to set the context for open source so that everybody should know what it's like, a small set of IP which is all about. Then we'll discuss few IPOs in M&A 1991 to 2021. And then the 8 major keys to open source strategies. Alright, so there are around 530 billion lines of open source code in all the repository on Google, and which would take an engineer over 10 million years to write. So this much code is available. We have as topic the right IP strategy can maximize value, IPO, M&A, and enterprise. Let me show some handy examples of enterprise using open source software and fulfilling licensing requirement and obligations. I start with this. Look, I boarded a Blue Smart cab in the morning around 4 a.m. today, and I saw the system were used in the cab was from Harman, and it was an infotainment system from Harman that used open source. So enterprise using open source, one example which is very handy, I saw in the morning. And if you see, the first is from the Instagram, second is from X, which is again it was Twitter, third is from Uber, and lastly from the iOS. So see, all these apps use open source software for the development, and as a part of the open source licensing obligation, they have to list down the attribution statement and notices along with the product. And in case of an app is the end product. So I click these screenshots in the morning for my handset and try to show to all of you. And lastly, if you see in the corner, anybody who using an iOS, they can quickly check this. It goes to general legal and regulatory legal notices. All the open source code which is being used by Apple for the iPhone, they have list down all the licensing notices, the author's name, and the full text of open source license in the documentation itself. So a very handy example of enterprising using open source. Now, moving to a very interesting part, which is IPO. All right. So I have around 46 companies of list from 1991 to 2021. This is not a full list, to be honest. And all put together, total estimate valuation of those companies around $214 billion. All based on open source. I try to take very large 5 examples. Let's start with Red Hat. They were started in 1991 and as a project, which was a personal project. And 1993 it was launched as a company. Their first round raised around $15 million. Today's strength about 19,500 employees. And estimated revenue 5,000, again it's always in millions. And valuation 34 billion. Finally it was acquired by IBM in around $34 billion. Purely open source based company, enterprise acquired. And then C Corp, again this license is MPL 2.0, 2010 personal project, minded like few copyright owners created a personal project that carved into a great company. And finally the IPO has come in 21 for $14.3 billion, pure open source. Then GitLab, I think everybody may have heard GitLab. Similar example, around $11 billion, it was the exit value for the IPO. Again, totally open source based commercial company. And GitHub, which was acquired by Microsoft for $7.5 billion, totally open source based company. And lastly, the Databricks is still private, it's not an IP, but I wanted to keep it because the valuation is pretty big high, $39 billion. So I would say these are the real example of, and I have 46 such companies, very small to medium, which has all put together $200+ billion valuations. So it's all open source. So that's why I want to emphasize why open source is very, very important to discuss and how it can be a small subset of the broader IP strategy. So now, coming to the takeaway, which is the key 8 keys to the open source strategy a company should apply while they're formulating an open source strategy. First is discovery and evaluation. I'll start one by one. So there are around 6,000 software repositories existing on the web. I think before I do that, let me set a little more context. How many of you have an engineer background here, from the tech background? Rest all are lawyers, is it? Okay, of course. So, see, like when a lawyer is supposed to draft an NDA, assume, okay? If I give you a plain paper to draft an NDA versus I give you a sample NDA to draft, to somehow edit and draft, which is the easier way. Of course, editing a draft, right? Not from the sketching from a blank paper. Similarly, a lot of open source code is available on the internet, which I told 530 billion lines of code. So when an engineer being tasked to craft a software, they can write their own or they can refer to open source or both. So in maximum cases, which is the data says 99% product. Like for example, Stephen mentioned about automotive, defense tech, marine systems. I'm sure all uses open source software up to an extent. In defense, there can be some limitation because of some sort of their CFPs and all. But a lot of products which we use in day-to-day life uses open source. Anyhow, so all the engineer who's supposed to create a software, instead of starting from a blank paper, they also refer to sources from the internet, which is open source. That's how it gets integrated with the product. Now coming back. So like this, there are 6,000 repositories on Google, like GitHub, SourceForge. And some of these repositories are in a dormant stage. Some of the repositories are pretty active where open source contribute code quite often. the selection of an open source repository is to be done on the basis of the maturity of the source code. So choosing the right repository from where the source can be copied, that's very, very important aspect. That's the main first point of the open source strategy. Now, moving on, the review and approval. So that's the second key. After the selection of an open source component from an approved repository, the expert, can be technical, legal, or should be both ideally, needs to conduct a thorough review of licensing, copyleft doctrine analysis, and interaction with the open source software. And yeah, so this is the first line of defense. It's like before the open source get integrate with the company's software, company's IP, they need to be reviewed and approved by an expert. Third is the supply chain management. I think Stephen also pointed out the IP risk, the contextual IP risk. Similar thing I have here first. Now, part of the open source licenses, the distributing entity is required to comply with the open source licenses. As one of the business model, like companies bundle their product with their partner's product and ship the final product under a SKU number. For example, most of the IT companies have an automotive division or BUs, right? They develop code for automotive product companies, and in literal terms, the code goes into the cars. Now, it will be sheer responsibility of the car manufacturer to comply with all the present open source licenses and ship all the applicable source code along with the product that is in the car. So, if we are taking product, so let's say code A, B from different vendors, collating it to X, so whoever is shipping the X is the responsible person or the entity for the entire open source compliance, even on behalf of the vendors. They have received the code from. And especially when it comes to the inbound outbound agreements. If as an entity I'm receiving the code, I'll make sure that I have those warranty and representation in my favor from the vendor. So that's why the inbound outbound aspect also need to be considered while drafting open source strategy. Moving on to, it's called the code management. It's basically when the discovery is done and the review approval is done, when the open source component is approved, how will you manage it? For example, like there should be some repo we need to maintain internally so that all the approved component can be a part of a larger repo where other engineers, other fellows can refer to those repo and use the approved code. So some sort of code management part need to be applied. That can be achieved via a tool. It's difficult to do it manually. What was there? So, and second last would be the maintenance and support. So, see, open source, again, if you go for a Windows, you get a support from Microsoft for a couple of years. Any issue, you can ping them and they'll help you. If you use Linux, it's free, but there's no support available for free of cost. If you want support, you have to pay for that. Similarly, for open source, at times in-house expertise is not available. So all the different BUs need to identify which all open source dependency they have for their products, and accordingly find out a right open source expert or companies who can provide support or maintenance on that. That's very important aspect, because generally engineers, they like in a company, they copy some code, they don't know how to handle it later. I would say not most of the cases, in few of the cases. So in-house expertise, if yes, perfect. If not, it need to be ensured in advance to have an outside expertise ready for open source support. Second last would be the compliance program, like which I showed you, the Instagram and X and Uber. Any open source software being used, they have major two obligations. One is the attribution, where the distributor, like the distributing entity, need to share the copyright information, the notices, and the license text in full. Second, the source code sharing. Few licenses has an obligation that if the distribution happening, the entire source code of that particular code base need to be offered to the recipient. And if there's any, like I'm sure the engineer may understand, the dynamic or static linking to a GPL or strong copyleft license code, the entire code base may be subject to open source. So those compliance programs need to be effective to ensure the IP is protected, and whatever open source obligation the company has should be fulfilled. And this is again very interesting point, the community interaction. See, as open source say, it's open, it's supported by the community. Like they're engineers. Things are changing now because maybe too much of commercialization of open source. Because earlier days, the passionate people were into open source. Like they wanted to do something really great for coding community. That's why they want to write code. That's how it all started, long back. I'm talking about 1990s or 80s. So again, as an entity, as a commercial company, if you're using open source, you can always contribute back to the community. So that should be a win-win for both. We are receiving open source from the community, we are giving back to the community. There can be ways to do that. As an individual, of course, you can you can contribute code using your personal email IDs. Perhaps you have the approval of your manager, whatever policy you have. Okay. So, and lastly is the executive oversight. So I think the same thing, your IP advisory board, I think mentioned by Stephen, the kind of similar thing. There should be one dedicated board, some sort of open source program office should oversee the entire exercise, the open source policy implementation and strategy aspect. So yeah, and these all are the 8 major keys that should be considered while drafting the open source strategy. So we can discuss the question later on. And I hand over to next participant, please. Thank you, team.
Thank you very much for Mr. Gaba's very comprehensive presentation.